Look at you two. So pathetic.
Look at them. They thought they were important. Important. They can't even get a roof over their heads.
This is going straight online.
Like father, like daughter. She'll end up with nothing.
Wait, don't move! Let me get a better video of this.
This is what happens when poor people try to dream too big. By next year, nobody will even remember the name.
Goodbye, Victoria. Don't bother coming back.
Have you ever been humiliated so deeply that the memory of it never fully leaves your body? Not just your mind, your body. The way your stomach drops, the way your throat closes, the way your hands shake, even though you are telling yourself to be still, be still, be still. I was 18 years old the first time I understood that some people in this world do not just enjoy watching you suffer. They need it. They have built their identity on top of your smallness, and the moment you threaten to grow, they will do anything to push you back down. My name is Victoria Adaeze Obi, and this is the story of how I was pushed down, how I got back up, and how I made sure that every single person who stood and watched and laughed lived long enough to understand exactly what they had done. My father's name was Emeka Obi. He was not a bad man. I need you to hear that before I tell you the rest, because the rest is ugly, and I do not want you to think his ugliness was all he was. He was also the man who used to carry me on his shoulders to the market on Saturday mornings, calling out to people, "You see this girl? This one will be a doctor one day." He was also the man who sang badly and loudly in the bathroom every morning, so badly that my mother, Adaeze, would press her lips together to hide her smile while pretending to be annoyed. But Emeka Obi had a sickness that took everything. Palm wine first, then kai kai, then whatever was cheapest and most available. By the time I was 14, he had borrowed money from half the village. By the time I was 17, he had borrowed from the other half. When he died, collapsed outside Clement Ongosu's drink joint on a Thursday evening, his heart finally surrendering to what his will could not, he left behind one grieving wife, one teenage daughter, and a debt list so long that it took the village moneylenders 3 separate meetings to tally it all up. The men who came to collect that debt did not come quietly. They came like a procession, like something ceremonial, like they had been waiting for this moment and wanted to dress it properly. Gideon Chukwu came first. He owned the biggest provision store in the village and 3 rental properties on the main road. A fat man with small eyes and the kind of smile that never fully reached them. He stood in our doorway with a document in his hand, a document my father had apparently signed on a night I do not want to imagine, and told my mother that the small plot of land our house sat on had been used as collateral for a loan 3 years ago. My mother stared at him. "Emeka signed this without telling me," she said. Her voice was very quiet. Gideon shrugged. He actually shrugged. "Madam, with due respect, the agreement is between me and your husband. Your husband is gone, the debt remains." Then came Mama Sonia, whose full name was Mrs. Blessing Adokwe, though nobody called her that. She was the most powerful woman in the village market, a trader who had turned groundnut oil into an empire over 30 years. She was also the most dangerous because she did her cruelty with a soft voice and a face arranged into permanent sympathy. She sat across from my mother in our parlor, teased at the state of our ceiling, and told her gently, kindly, with her hands folded and her voice full of sorrow, that the sewing machine and the small generator my father had borrowed money to buy both belonged to her now, as per the terms of a loan agreement she produced from her handbag, like she had been carrying it there for months. Because she had been waiting. And then there was Lawrence Ebuka, the man I hated most. Not because he was the loudest or the most aggressive, he wasn't. Lawrence was quiet, educated, he wore glasses and drove a clean car and went to church every Sunday in the front pew. He was the kind of man people called responsible. He had been my father's closest friend for 20 years. He came to our house on the 4th day. He sat down. He asked after our well-being. He accepted the cup of tea my mother offered because she was that kind of woman, the kind who offers tea to people who are about to destroy her. He drank it slowly. Then he put down his cup, opened his briefcase, and placed a document on the table that made my mother's face go completely white. The land. Not just the plot our house sat on, the family land, the full parcel my grandfather had cleared with his own hands and passed to my father. 2 plots with the old guava tree at the corner that my mother used to make juice from every Christmas. My father had borrowed against all of it. Lawrence had the papers, clean, signed, witnessed papers. My mother said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, hollow and far away, like something speaking from inside a well, "Lawrence, you were his friend." Lawrence looked at her over his glasses. "Adaize, I was his friend, not his bank. The agreement was legal. I am sorry for your loss." He stood up, buttoned his jacket, picked up his briefcase, and left. My mother sat at that table for a very long time after he left. I sat across from her, watching her face, watching her try to find a place inside herself to put what had just happened, and I felt something happen inside me that I did not have a name for then. I have a name for it now. Calcification. The soft thing inside me that had still believed people were basically decent, that thing hardened permanently into something that would take a very long time to build into a weapon. The eviction notice came 10 days later. We had 2 weeks. I will not spend too many words on the morning we left because those words will cost me something I no longer wish to spend on those people. I will tell you only the essential things. I will tell you that it was a Saturday, that it rained briefly in the morning and then stopped, like even the sky could not commit to morning for us. I will tell you that we packed everything we owned into 2 bags and 1 box, and that the box was too heavy for my mother to carry, so I carried it myself, even though my arms shook. I will tell you that people came out to watch. Some of them I had known since I was a child. Mrs. Ifelma, who had once treated my fever when my mother had no money for a doctor. Brother Tunde from the church choir, who used to say, "God bless you," every Sunday, like he meant it. Children I had played with in this same red dust, whose mothers knew my mother. They stood and they watched, and none of them, not one of them, said, "This is wrong." I will tell you about Sonia. Sonia was Mama Sonia's daughter, 20 years old, fair-skinned, always dressed like she had somewhere important to be, even when she was just buying pepper in the market. She had made my life a particular kind of hell throughout secondary school, the quiet, sustained kind of cruelty that doesn't leave visible marks. Whispering, excluding, looking at my second-hand uniform with that particular expression that means, "I see you and I find you disgusting." She stood near the front of the crowd that morning with her phone raised. She was recording. She was recording us being evicted. My mother, our furniture on the road, our 2 bags. She was recording it to share. And she was smiling while she did it. I looked directly at her camera for one long moment before I turned away. I want you to understand. That was not defeat in my eyes. That was me memorizing her face. My mother and I walked down that red road with everything we owned and the entire village watching our backs. Nobody called after us. Nobody came running. The road was just road and we were just walking, and the village shrank behind us like something that had never deserved to be home. When we reached the junction, my mother sat down on a concrete block, wrapped herself around her, and wept. I stood over her. I did not cry. Not because I felt nothing, because I felt too much to afford tears. I put my hand on her shoulder and I made her a promise. I did not say it out loud. I kept it inside where it would stay hot. I will come back, and when I come back, not one of them will be able to look at me without feeling what you are feeling right now. We took a bus to Onitsha with 3,000 naira and a phone number my mother had for a distant cousin who owed us nothing and knew it. The cousin, a woman named Favor, let us sleep in her corridor for 6 weeks before the guilt of it, or perhaps the inconvenience of it, moved her to help my mother find a single room in a compound nearby. The room was small enough that when we both lay down at night, our feet nearly touched the opposite wall. The ceiling had a water stain shaped like a hand. I stared at that stain so many nights I began to see it as a clock. I will not romanticize those years. There was a period when my mother and I ate garri twice a day for 11 days straight because the trading capital she had started with ran out before the small provision business she was trying to build could stand on its own. I know the exact texture of that particular hunger. The way it stops feeling like pain after a while and starts feeling like weather. Just something that exists, just something you move through. I hawked groundnuts near the motor park before school. I washed clothes for a woman on our street on weekends. I did not tell anyone at the school I eventually enrolled in what my situation was because I had learnt very young that people do not treat information about your poverty as a confidence. They treat it as entertainment. What saved me, the thing that truly saved me, was numbers. I had always been good with numbers, not in the way teachers mean when they say a student is good at mathematics. I mean something more intuitive than that. I could look at a transaction and feel where the weight was. I could look at a market and understand what was moving and what was standing still. My economics teacher in secondary school, a thin, serious man named Mr. Okonkwo, had once told me I had the instincts of someone who would either make a great deal of money or understand exactly why she hadn't. I intended to make the money. After my WAEC, I got a clerical job at a property agency in Onitsha through sheer persistence. I went to the office every day for 2 weeks until the manager, a bald man named Fred Igwe, hired me just to make me stop appearing in his doorway. Fred turned out to be a surprisingly good teacher when he bothered, and what I learned in that office about land documentation, valuation, and debt recovery was worth more than any classroom. It was Fred who first used a phrase that reordered something in my brain. We were going through distressed property files one afternoon, properties whose owners owed more than they could pay, and I asked him what happened to these people. He said, the land doesn't care who owns it, the land just waits. Whoever has the right paper at the right time owns the story. Whoever has the right paper at the right time owns the story. I wrote it in my notebook and stared at it that night for an hour. Over the next 8 years, I built myself piece by piece. A diploma in estate management, a professional certification, a short course in Lagos that cost me 4 months of saved salary and was worth every kobo. I moved from clerical to junior executive to branch manager. I saved with a discipline that people around me found uncomfortable. My colleague Abby once said, half joking, that I ate like someone who was punishing herself. She wasn't entirely wrong. Every naira I didn't spend was a naira closer to something I had not yet told anyone about. At 30, I registered my company, Gold Root Properties and Development. My mother cried when she saw the registration certificate. She held it in both hands the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. She said, "Victoria, you did it." I said, "Mama, this is just the beginning." What I did not tell her, what I had been quietly, carefully preparing for 3 years, was that I had already begun pulling threads in the direction of our village. I had commissioned a property and debt search on all 3 families through a legal contact. I had made quiet inquiries. I had been patient in the way that only people who have been truly, deeply wronged can be patient. Not the patience of someone who has moved on, but the patience of someone who is waiting. And what I found had made me sit very still for a long time. Gideon Chukwu's provision store empire had overextended. He had borrowed from 2 commercial banks and a cooperative to fund a cold room business that had not performed. The loans were secured against his main property. Mama Sonia, Mrs. Blessing Adokwe, had invested heavily in a supply contract with a state government ministry. The contract had been cancelled after a change in administration. She had taken a bridge loan to cover the gap. The bridge loan was 3 years old and had compounded terribly. Lawrence Ebuka, my father's friend, the man with the clean car and the glasses and the briefcase, had mortgaged his family house to fund his son Jaden's education abroad and a failed importation business. The mortgage was in arrears. They were all in trouble. They just didn't know that I knew. If Victoria's story is already gripping you, I need you to do one thing right now. Subscribe to Reina Tales, because what she does next with this information will shake you to your core. Don't miss it. We'll be right back inside Victoria's story.
I spent the next 14 months acquiring their debts through a company I set up specifically for this purpose, a holding company with a neutral name registered in Abuja with no visible connection to me or to Goldroot. I used an intermediary law firm for every transaction. I paid clean market rates for each debt. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. I was not building a fire. I was building a wall. A wall around every asset those three families used to stand tall while my mother wept in the road. When the last acquisition closed, I sat in my office in Onitsha for a long time without moving. Then I called my mother and told her I was going home. She asked me why. I said, because it is time.
I drove into the village on a Wednesday morning, alone. No convoy, no announcement, no drama. Not yet. I had learned in 12 years of business that the loudest entrance is rarely the most powerful one. Real power arrives quietly and lets people discover it on their own terms, so that by the time they understand what is happening, it has already happened. I wore a simple black dress and flat shoes. I had my driver drop me at the junction and I walked the last stretch on foot, the same road I had walked out of 12 years ago, carrying a box too heavy for my arms. The road was the same, still red, still dusty. The mango tree at the Onuosu compound was bigger. The church had been repainted. A new barbing salon had opened in what used to be an abandoned store. People recognized me slowly, the way you recognize something you are not sure you are allowed to believe in. A woman near the borehole stopped, made conversation, and stared. Two men outside the barbing salon watched me pass with narrowed eyes, performing the mental arithmetic of memory. A child ran ahead. I don't know why children always run ahead at moments like this. Some instinct for announcement. And by the time I reached the market square, there was already a current running through the village, a whisper moving faster than I was walking. Is that not Emeka Obi's daughter, the one they drove out? Is that not Victoria? I bought a sachet water from a woman I did not recognize, drank it, and kept walking. I had one stop to make before anything else. I went to the guava tree. It was still there at the corner of what had been my grandfather's land and was now, on paper, mine. Still rooted, still bearing fruit, indifferent to everything that had happened around it, the way trees are. They outlast our cruelties simply by not paying attention to them. I put my hand on the back and stood there for a moment. Then I took out my phone and called Efe, my operations manager. I said, begin. The letters went out that afternoon. Formal, legal, printed on the holding company's letterhead. 3 separate letters to 3 separate addresses, each one informing the recipient that their outstanding loan obligations had been acquired and were now due in full within 45 days, or enforcement proceedings would commence under the terms of the original agreements. 45 days, not 60. I had deliberately shortened the window. I wanted them to feel the ground shift faster than they could steady themselves. By Thursday evening, the village had caught fire. Not literally in the way that information burns through a small community when it carries enough heat. Gideon Chukwu had reportedly read his letter 3 times and then sat in his store for an hour without speaking to any customers. Mama Sonia had immediately called her lawyer, who had called the holding company's lawyers, who had been politely and thoroughly unhelpful. Lawrence Ebuka had driven to Alka to consult a legal friend. I heard all of this through Chisom, a woman who had been kind to my mother when we were still in the village, who ran a food store near the market. Chisom had my number because my mother had given it to her years ago. She called me on Thursday night, her voice both excited and frightened, like someone watching a controlled fire from what she hoped was a safe distance. Victoria, she said, these people are shaking. The whole village is shaking. Is it true that the holding company is yours? I said, it will be confirmed soon enough. Gideon came and asked me if I knew where you were staying. And what did you tell him? I told him I didn't know, which was true at the time. A pause. Victoria, what are you planning? I said, Chisom,
Do you remember the morning they put our things in the road? A long silence. Yes. Do you remember what you did? Another short silence. I watched. I didn't say anything. I have felt bad about that for a long time. I know, I said. You are not who I am coming for. On Friday morning, Gideon Chukwu came to find me at the guest house where I was staying. He was not what I had expected physically. He was older, smaller somehow than memory had made him. The fat was still there, but it had shifted, softened. His eyes were still small. They were also, for the first time in my experience of them, afraid. He sat across from me in the guest house sitting room, and he spoke for a long time about community, about understanding, about the complicated nature of debt, and how my father had been a willing participant in those agreements. I let him speak. When he finished, I said, Gideon, do you remember Sonia recording my mother on her phone while we were being evicted? He blinked. The shift in subject destabilized him, which was the intention. That has nothing to do with, do you remember, I said, that nobody in this village said one word in our defense, not one person told you that what you were doing was wrong? He opened his mouth. The debt is real. The papers are legal. I did not forge anything or steal anything. I simply bought what was available, the same way you bought what was available 12 years ago. I leaned forward slightly. Gideon, the difference is, when you took from us, we had nowhere to go and nothing to fall back on. You knew that. You used that. Don't come to me now talking about community. He left without what he came for. Mama Sonia did not come herself. She sent Sonia. Sonia, who had stood in the crowd with her phone raised, smiling.
I want to tell you about the moment Sonia walked into that guest house sitting room because I have replayed it many times and it still contains things I am still learning from. She was 32 now, still fair-skinned, still carefully put together, wearing a dress that suggested she had taken care with herself before this meeting. But something in her face had been rearranged by years and by the news that had broken over her family in the past 48 hours. She looked like a person who has rehearsed something and then, arriving at the moment, realized the rehearsal was nowhere near sufficient. She sat down. She did not begin with pleasantries. She said, "My mother cannot pay the full amount in 45 days. You know that." I said, "I know the amount. I don't know what your mother can or cannot do." "Sonia," she said, my name the way people say the name of someone they need something from, carefully, with weight. "We are asking for an extension. 6 months. My mother will restructure." "Sonia," I said. She stopped. "Do you remember the morning you filmed us?" The silence that followed was different from any silence I had experienced in that room. It had texture. It had heat. "Sonia, I was 20 years old." "Do you still have the video?" She looked at me. Her jaw moved once without producing sound. "Did you post it? Did your friends see it? Did you laugh about it afterward?" "I was stupid," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that sounded real enough that I felt something move in my chest. I was young and I was stupid, and I have thought about that morning more times than you know. "More times than I know," I repeated. "Sonia, I have not had a single week in 12 years where I didn't think about your face above that phone." She put her hand over her mouth. "Here is what I want you to understand," I said. "I am not extending that deadline because your mother needs more time. I am not extending it because of community or because of shared origin or because of any version of the story where I am the one who needs to be reasonable." I held her gaze. If your mother can restructure and pay, she should begin that process now, within the original timeline. My lawyers are available to discuss a payment structure within the 45 days if she can demonstrate capacity. That is the only flexibility I am offering. Sonia stood up. Her eyes were wet. Something in the way she held her body, straight but barely, reminded me painfully, unwantedly, of my mother. I pushed that thought away. She said at the door without turning around, "You became everything she always said you would never be." I said nothing.
After she left, I sat for a while. I was not unmoved, I want to be honest. Cruelty that has already been done does not become retroactively painless just because you have power now. The wounds don't heal in reverse. But I had made a decision years ago that my pain would have a shape, that it would build things rather than just destroy them. That distinction mattered to me more than mercy mattered to me. The meeting with Lawrence Ebuka was the one I had prepared for most and dreaded most. He requested to meet at a neutral location, the church hall, which I found either tone deaf or brilliantly uncomfortable depending on how I looked at it. I agreed. Lawrence was 61. His hair was fully grey now. He still wore glasses. He still had that quality of performed respectability that had always made me distrust him more than the others. Because with Gideon, you could see the greed plainly, and with Mama Sonia, you could see the ambition plainly. But with Lawrence, it had always been wrapped in something that looked like virtue. He sat down across me in the empty church hall with the afternoon light coming through the louver windows, and he said, "Victoria, I want to start by saying that what I did to your family weighs on me." "Does it?" I said. "Your father was my friend. What happened after his death? You sat in our parlor, you accepted my mother's tea, then you opened your briefcase and took our land." His hands folded on the table tightened slightly. The agreement was legal. "Yes, so is mine," I said. He looked at me for a long time, performing, I thought, the expression of a man who is in conversation with his conscience. "I have a question for you, Lawrence," I said, "and I want an honest answer, not a legal answer, an honest one." He nodded carefully. "Did you know when my father was alive and borrowing that he was an alcoholic who did not understand what he was signing?" The silence was its own answer. "Did you give him those loans anyway, knowing that?" Emeka was a grown man. "Did you know?" He looked away. Yes, I knew, finally. I sat with that for a moment. "Then we are done here," I said. "My lawyers will handle the rest." I stood up and I walked out of the church where Lawrence Ebuka had sat in the front pew every Sunday for 30 years, performing goodness, and I did not look back. The 45 days came and went. Mama Sonia made a partial payment, significant, but less than a third of what was owed. My lawyers informed her that partial payment did not suspend enforcement proceedings and that the remainder was still due. She made another payment. It still was not enough. Gideon Chukwu's lawyers attempted 3 separate legal challenges. All 3 failed. The documentation was clean. Every acquisition had been above board. His lawyers were fighting paperwork with frustration, which is not a winning strategy. Lawrence Ebuka did not attempt to fight. He simply called my office one afternoon, spoke to my assistant, and left a message asking if there was any possibility of a personal conversation before enforcement. I did not return the call. The enforcement of Gideon's property was the first, and the village watched it the way villages watch things, from doorways and compound gates, and behind the pretense of other business. The locks went on. The formal notice was posted. Gideon's provision store tenants, there were 4 of them by this time, small businesses renting units in the building, had been notified in advance and given 60 days relocation support, which I had insisted on and paid for myself. They were not Gideon. They did not deserve to absorb his consequences. Gideon himself stood outside his store on the morning the enforcement team arrived and watched it happen. Chisom, who called me that evening, said he had not said a single word the entire time. She said, "Victoria, he just stood there like wood. The same way," I said, "the same way we stood." She was quiet. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." Mama Sonia's enforcement came a week later. Her main property, the large building she had built from 30 years of market trading, the one she had walked around in like a queen, the one that Sonia had grown up in, went into receivership. Sonia called me that evening, not to negotiate. She had passed that stage. She called and she said only, "I hope you feel what you wanted to feel." And then she hung up. I thought about that for a long time. Did I feel what I wanted to feel? Not exactly. Watching cruelty catch up to people is not as clean or as satisfying as the imagination makes it when you are standing inside the moment and not dreaming of it from a distance. There is grief in it, unexpected grief, for the versions of those people that might have existed if greed and smallness had not won in them. There is also something that is not grief, a settling, a leveling, a feeling like a door closing on a room that had been open and cold for too long. Lawrence's house was the last. The house where his family had lived for decades. The house his mortgage had almost paid off before he borrowed against it for Jaden's education and the failed business. Jaden had apparently returned from abroad 2 years prior, his degree earned, with no knowledge of the full extent of what his father had done or what was now happening. He came to find me. He was 28, taller than his father, without the glasses, with a directness about him that I had not expected. He said, "I want to understand what my father did." I told him, plainly, all of it. He sat with it. Then he said, "Is there anything that can be done to keep the house?" I said, "The balance is significant. Can you cover it?" He could cover part of it. We worked out a structured buyback arrangement over 3 years, with clear terms and no renegotiation if payments lapsed. It was not a favor. It was a business arrangement offered to a young man who had not been the architect of his own misfortune. Laurent called me afterward, having heard about the arrangement from Jaden. He said, "Thank you." I said, "I didn't do it for you, Lawrence." He said, "I know. I did it for Jaden, and I did it because my father also had a child who deserved better than the life his choices made." Laurent Ebuka wept on the phone. I do not know if it was genuine. I do not know if it matters. I hung up and looked out my window for a long time. Then I called my contractors. Because the other properties, Gideon's building, Mama Sonia's compound, I had plans for. Real plans. Concrete and steel plans. The kind that change a landscape permanently. I want to tell you what it looks like now. Because the buildings matter. Because what you build on top of pain is the truest answer of the question of who you are. Gideon Chukwu's former property, the provision store building he had borrowed himself into losing, became the Adaizim Market Complex, named for my mother. 12 trading units on the ground floor, affordable rates set deliberately below market, priority allocation given to small traders who had been renting on the street for years, with no stability, no shade, no security. Women who sold tomatoes and peppers and crayfish, men who repaired phones on plastic tables, the kinds of people who had always been there, always working, always one rainstorm away from losing their day's trade. I remember standing in the completed complex on the day it opened and watching Chisom walk slowly through the ground floor with her hand trailing along the wall, her mouth slightly open. She said, "Victoria, she said your name would come to nothing." "Who said that?" I asked, though I already knew. "Gideon's wife. The day they put your dings in the road, she said that girl will come to nothing like her father." I looked around the building. "Tell me," I said, "is her name on anything in this village?" Chisom smiled slowly. "No." "And whose name is over that entrance?" She looked up at the sign. "Adaize Market Complex." "Your mother's," she said. "My mother's," I said. "The woman they humiliated." Sonia's compound took longer to develop. The building was older and needed more structural work before I could do what I wanted with it. I brought in an architect from Enugu and we spent 4 months on the design. What stands there now is the Obi Vocational and Skills Center, a training facility offering 6-month programs in tailoring, catering, electrical installation, phone repairs, and digital skills. Free for any resident under 25, subsidized for anyone else. On the day of the opening, I invited my mother. Adaize Obi walked through those doors in a yellow dress. She likes yellow. She says it refuses to be sad. And she stood in the main training hall and turned slowly, taking it in. The sewing machines along one wall, the cooking stations, the young people already seated and waiting. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, Sonia told people I would die in that rented room in Onitsha. I said, Mama. She said it in the market. Someone told me. She touched the wall of the training hall. Now her mother's house is teaching children how to survive. There is a kind of justice that is so complete, it looks almost like poetry. I let my mother stand there for as long as she wanted. Sonia herself I had not seen since the day she came to the guest house. I had heard she and her family had relocated to another town. I heard through Chisom that she had started a small business there. I did not track it. I did not need to. My interest in Sonia had always been about what she represented, the casual, entitled cruelty of people who film suffering because it makes them feel elevated. She was no longer elevated. Whether she had learnt anything from that fall was between her and whatever she believed in. Gideon Chukwu had taken a small apartment somewhere and was reportedly working as a consultant, advising small businesses on supply chains using the knowledge his failed empire had given him. He was not destitute. I had not set out to destroy a person, only to recover what had been taken and ensure the ground could never be used to stand on us again. But here is the thing about Gideon that I think about sometimes. He drove past the Adaize market complex 3 months after it opened. Chisom told me. She said he slowed down in front of it, looked at the sign with my mother's name on it, and drove away. I do not know what he felt. I hope it was something real. On the first anniversary of the Obi Vocational Center's opening, a girl named Favor, 17 years old, the daughter of a widowed woman who sold firewood, received a certificate for completing the tailoring program. She stood up in the ceremony and said she had come to the center because she had heard it was the only place in the area that trained you for free and asked nothing back except you worked hard. She said she had been afraid walking in that there was a catch. There was always a catch, she said. She looked directly at me. I was sitting in the front row, and she said, there was no catch. They just taught me. I am not a woman who cries easily. I cried. My mother, sitting beside me, took my hand and held it. What I want to say to you, the person listening to this, the person who has followed Victoria through 12 years of hunger and silence and building, is this. The village that threw us out did not throw out a girl. They threw out a fire. They just didn't know in that moment that fires don't die when you throw them into the road. They travel. They find air and fuel and purpose. They burn through the night in places you can't see. And then they come back. Lawrence Ebuka attended the second anniversary of the Adaize Market Complex opening. I know because Chisom sent me a photo. He was standing near the entrance, grey-haired, small-looking, watching the traders go in and out of the building that existed because of what he had done. He did not approach me. He stood there for a while. Then he left. I do not know if that was penance or grief or just an old man being uncomfortable with the evidence of his own history. I do not need to know. My mother is 63 years old and she visits the clinic we set up in the next compound every Friday. She brings food for the nurses, she sits with patients who have been waiting too long, she holds the hand of women who are afraid. She has a purpose now that she built inside her suffering and refused to put down. Gideon's small eyes, Lawrence's briefcase, Sonia's phone raised and recording.
They thought they were documenting an ending. They were documenting the beginning. I am Victoria Adaize Obi, Emeka's daughter, Adaize's daughter, the girl they carried out of the village in a too heavy box with shaking arms. I came back. I bought the ground they stood on, and I built something on it that will outlast all of us. This is Raina Tales. If this story hit you somewhere real, share it right now with someone who needs to be reminded that what they are going through is not where their story ends. Subscribe to Raina Tales for new stories every week. We will see you in the next one.